Raised on a ranch, she always dreamed of escape, but the land that imprisons her hides a secret, her only friend, an untamed horse, connected to a mystery that could change everything. When she discovers the truth about her family, she realizes it's time to fight. Welcome to the channel. Before we begin, like and subscribe so we can continue creating stories like this one. The sun had not yet risen when Sarah Morgan was already up. At 22, she knew every inch of Hope Ranch, located in rural Virginia, like the back of her hand. The property, which stretched across acres of verdant fields and gentle hills, was one of the most respected horse breeding facilities in the region. To any visitor, the place would be a picture of paradise, but for Sarah it was a gilded prison. As she walked among the stables, the smell of damp earth and fresh straw filled her lungs. It was the only moment of peace she experienced before her father, Frank Morgan, woke up. Since the departure of her mother, Rebecca, 3 years ago, her father's temperament had transformed. The man who once smiled and told stories by the campfire was now just a bitter shadow, consumed by resentment and alcohol. "Good morning, Thunder," whispered Sarah, approaching an imposing black Tennessee walking horse with a coat as dark as night. The animal whinnied softly, recognizing the voice of the young woman who had raised him from a colt. Thunder was her only confidant, the only living being who seemed to understand her pain. When tears streamed down her face after another day of humiliation and punishment, it was in the soft coat of that animal that she hid her face. And he, as if understanding every unspoken word, remained still, offering the silent comfort that no one else provided. The scar on her right forearm, still fresh, throbbed slightly. It was the result of another of her father's fits of rage when she had dropped a bucket of water while cleaning the stables. The whip that Frank used to tame the more rebellious horses had found her skin many times over the years. The physical marks healed, but the emotional wounds only deepened. "Sarah, where have you gotten to, girl?" Frank's thunderous voice echoed across the field, sending birds flying from nearby trees. Sarah's heart raced. The watch on her wrist showed only 5:30 in the morning. It was too early for him to be awake, which meant he had slept poorly, probably after another night of drinking. And days that began like this rarely ended well. "I'm here in the stable, Dad," she responded, trying to keep her voice steady while giving Thunder one last caress before leaving. Frank Morgan was a tall man with broad shoulders and a face marked by the sun and premature wrinkles. His eyes, which once shone with the same honey tone as Sarah's, now seemed opaque, lifeless. In one hand he held a nearly empty bottle. In the other, the leather whip that made Sarah freeze inside. "What are you doing here so early?" he asked, his slurred voice betraying his state. "Planning to run away with one of my horses, is that it?" "No, Dad. I just came to feed them earlier, so I could help at the town fair afterward," she replied, eyes fixed on the ground. "Fair? Who said you're going to the fair?" His laugh came out harsh, cutting. "What do you think this is, a hotel where you come and go as you please? There are handlers to be paid, veterinarians to hire, and here you are, wanting to go out." Before Sarah could respond, Mrs. Betty, the cook who had worked at the ranch for more than 2 decades, appeared at the stable door. Her round, maternal face contorted with concern as she assessed the scene. "Mr. Morgan, breakfast is on the table. Jimmy has already arrived to take care of the animals, and the buyers from Atlanta should be here in an hour to see the bay horse." Betty's intervention, as always, was providential. Frank lowered the whip, muttering incomprehensible words as he headed toward the main house. Sarah released the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "He started early today," murmured Betty, approaching and discreetly examining Sarah's arm. "This wound still hasn't healed properly. Come with me to the kitchen. I'll put some ointment on it." In the cozy kitchen, while Betty tended to her arm, Sarah observed the activity of the ranch through the window. Stable hands led horses out for their morning exercise. Visitors arrived to see the animals for sale, and her father, now more composed, was receiving a wealthy couple interested in one of the colts. "How long will you endure this, my child?" asked Betty, her voice low so that no one else could hear. "What can I do, Mrs. Betty? Where would I go? I have no money, no family besides him. Your mother wouldn't want to see you like this." The mention of Rebecca always caused a tightness in Sarah's chest. Her mother had been the light of this place, the reason why the ranch had prospered. Her talent with horses was legendary and her patience infinite. When she left, she took with her not only the joy of the ranch, but also Frank's humanity. "She had plans for you, you know," continued Betty, finishing the bandage. "You weren't meant to be trapped here forever." Sarah was about to ask more about these plans when Frank's voice thundered again, calling for her. The brief moment of peace was over. The rest of the day passed like so many others, Sarah working under the scorching sun, taming colts, cleaning stables, feeding the animals, and avoiding her father's volatile gaze and temperament. When she finally had a moment to herself, it was already night, and hidden in the stable she took out a worn, small notebook that she kept hidden under a loose board. It was her mother's diary, the only thing she had managed to save when Frank, in a fit of rage after Rebecca's departure, had burned all her belongings. In the yellowed pages, Sarah found not only refuge, but also clues to a story that had never been fully told to her. "There are secrets on this ranch that will one day come to light," read one of the last notes. "And when that happens, my daughter will know that Hope Ranch was always more hers than anyone else's." What did her mother mean by that? What secrets were these? Before she could reflect more, she heard footsteps approaching. Quickly she hid the diary and pretended to be just checking on Thunder's condition. And when she saw her father's silhouette at the entrance to the stable, whip in hand and bloodshot eyes, Sarah knew the night would be long. What she didn't know was that it would also be the night when everything would change forever. "So this is where you hide when you should be organizing the documents for tomorrow's inspection." Frank's voice tore through the silence of the stable like thunder on a clear night. Sarah rose quickly, her trembling hands smoothing the apron soiled with dirt. "I'm not hiding, Dad. I was checking if Thunder is ready for tomorrow's demonstration." Frank approached, and the strong smell of whiskey invaded Sarah's nostrils. His eyes, normally brown, seemed almost black in the weak light of the lantern. "This animal should have been sold months ago," he spat, looking with contempt at Thunder. "The rancher from Pine Creek offered a fortune for him, but you whined. So much that I ended up refusing. My mistake." "Thunder isn't just a horse for sale, Dad. He's special, has rare lineage. Mom always said that." The mention of Rebecca was enough. Frank's face contorted into a mask of fury, and the whip cut through the air before Sarah could finish her sentence. By pure reflex, she raised her arm to protect herself, and the leather hit exactly where the recent wound was still sensitive. The sharp pain made her scream. "Don't you dare mention her name," shouted Frank, raising the whip again. "That ungrateful woman abandoned everything we built together, abandoned you, and she still has the audacity to send letters as if she had any right to this land." Sarah froze. Letters? Her mother had sent letters. Frank had never mentioned this before, but she had no time to process the information as the whip was coming down again. She closed her eyes, waiting for the impact that never came. Instead of the expected pain, she heard a furious neigh. Opening her eyes, she saw Thunder reared up between her and her father, his front hooves agitating threateningly in the air. The immense animal had freed himself from his stall and now formed a protective barrier between father and daughter. Frank backed away, surprised by the normally docile horse's attitude. Even in his state of inebriation, he knew that confronting an enraged horse was dangerous. Thunder wasn't just any animal. He was a purebred, too valuable to be damaged. "Control that animal, Sarah," he demanded, his voice now more controlled, but no less threatening. "Thunder, calm down," she whispered, stroking the animal's neck with trembling hands. But to her surprise, the horse didn't back down. He remained firm, eyes fixed on Frank as if challenging him. It was then that Mrs. Betty appeared at the stable door, breathless. "Mr. Morgan, telephone. It's the buyer from New York," he says. "It's urgent." Frank hesitated, looking from Sarah to the horse and then to Betty. Finally, he lowered the whip. "Don't think this is over," he threatened, addressing Sarah. "And tomorrow I'll decide this animal's future. It's past time for him to be worth what he's worth." When Frank finally left, Sarah hugged Thunder's neck, allowing the tears she had held back to finally flow. The horse remained calm now, as if He understood that his role as protector had been fulfilled. "I saw everything from the kitchen window," said Betty, approaching cautiously. "I've never seen an animal act like that before. It's as if he knew." "He does know," murmured Sarah, wiping away her tears. "Thunder has always known when I'm in danger." Betty took Sarah's arm carefully, examining the red mark where the whip had struck. "This can't continue, my child, if your mother were here." "But she's not," interrupted Sarah, frustration emerging after years of submission. "She left and left me here with him, and now I discover that she sent letters that never reached me." Betty's face contorted in an expression that mixed guilt and concern. "There are many things you don't know, Sarah. Your mother didn't abandon you. What happened was much more complicated than your father wants you to believe. What are you talking about?" Betty looked around, checking if they were truly alone, and then moved even closer, lowering her voice to almost a whisper. "Rebecca was planning to take you with her. She had documents, evidence that this ranch doesn't legally belong to your father. That's why she left, to gather more evidence, to fight for what was rightfully hers, what will be yours one day." Sarah felt as if the ground had opened beneath her feet. For years she had believed that her mother had left of her own free will, leaving her behind. The possibility that the story was different, that there was a greater purpose behind that abandonment, had never occurred to her. "And the letters?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Your father intercepted them. Some he burned, others he kept. I think as a form of torture, knowing something you didn't know." Betty took Sarah's hands in hers. "But there's more. Your mother entrusted something to me before she left, something I should give to you when it was safe." Sarah's heart raced. "What?" Betty hesitated, looking again at the stable door to make sure they were still alone. "Not here, not now. Your father could return at any moment. Come to my house tomorrow after the demonstration for the buyers. I'll say I need you to help me with the pantry inventory." Thunder whinnied softly, as if approving the plan. Sarah stroked his neck, her mind buzzing with unanswered questions. What secrets had her mother kept? What documents were these that could change the fate of Hope Ranch? "I need to get back to the house before he notices my absence," said Betty, heading to the door. She paused for a moment, turning to look at Sarah once more. "Be strong, my child, and keep an eye on Thunder. Your father is determined to sell him, and after what happened today, I fear what he might do." Sarah nodded, a weight settling in her chest. When Betty left, she sat down in the hay, her mother's diary still hidden under the loose board. Thunder approached, laying his large head in her lap, as he had done since he was a colt. It was as if he understood every word said, every emotion felt. "What are we going to do, Thunder?" she whispered, running her fingers through his silky mane. "If he tries to sell you, I can't lose you too." The silence of the stable was broken only by the distant sound of an owl. Outside, the moon illuminated the fields of Hope Ranch, a place built with love that was now the scene of so much suffering. But in the shadows of that night, a seed of courage was beginning to germinate in Sarah's heart. If what Betty said was true, perhaps there was a chance for liberation. Carefully she removed the diary from its hiding place and opened it to the last page she had read. There, in her mother's words, she might find the answers she was seeking. Perhaps finally she would discover the path home, the true home, the one her heart knew existed, beyond the bonds of fear and oppression. And as she read by the weak light of the lantern, with Thunder as a silent sentinel, Sarah didn't imagine that the next day would bring the decisive moment that would change her life forever. A moment when she would have to choose between the safety of everything she knew and the uncertainty of a free future. A moment when Thunder, once again, would prove to be much more than just a horse. The day of the demonstration dawned with a fine mist, covering the fields of Hope Ranch. Sarah had slept little, her thoughts agitated by Betty's revelation and the words written by her mother in the diary. She had spent the night reading and rereading the notes, looking for clues about the documents, about the true owner of the ranch, about Rebecca's plan. The old oak, holds more than shade," said one of the most enigmatic notes. Sarah knew that Treewell, the century-old oak that stood near the creek that cut through the property. It was her mother's favorite place, where they used to have picnics on sunny Sundays before everything fell apart. "Sarah, the buyers are already arriving," shouted Frank from the veranda of the main house. She took a deep breath, adjusted her riding clothes and headed for the demonstration field. Thunder was already being prepared by Jimmy, the ranch's oldest handler. The thin, sun-tanned man gave Sarah a concerned look when she approached. "The boss is determined to sell Thunder today," he whispered, adjusting the reins. "The buyer from Atlanta brought a blank check." Sarah felt the blood freeze in her veins. Losing Thunder would be like losing her last link to freedom, to hope. It would be like losing her own soul. "I won't let that happen, Jimmy," she replied, her voice firmer than she felt inside. The buyers were a middle-aged couple, owners of a network of ranches in the southeast. Frank received them with his best commercial smile, the one he reserved only for those who could yield good profits. The temporary sobriety made him almost unrecognizable to Sarah. "My daughter will demonstrate the animal's qualities," announced Frank, gesturing for Sarah to mount. "She has a special gift with him, inherited from her mother, who had golden hands for taming even the wildest ones." The mention of Rebecca without the usual disdain surprised Sarah. This was the character her father embodied in front of strangers, the devoted widower, the loving father, the fair owner, a mask that fell as soon as the visitors left the property. Mounting. Thunder. Sarah felt the immediate connection they always shared. The horse seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, responding to commands with millimetric precision. Together they performed a series of movements that demonstrated not only the excellence of the training, but also the unique bond between rider and mount. "Impressive," commented the buyer, applauding at the end of the demonstration. "I've never seen such perfect synchrony." "Imagine what professional riders could do with an animal of this quality," added Frank, insinuating that Sarah's talent was merely amateur. "Actually," intervened the buyer's wife, an elegant woman with grey hair, "I think much of the performance is due to the young woman's connection with the animal. Perhaps we should consider hiring her as well, don't you think, dear?" Frank's gaze darkened for a second, but the commercial smile quickly returned. "I'm afraid that's not possible. Sarah is essential to the functioning of the ranch. Besides," he added, placing a falsely affectionate arm around his daughter's shoulders, "she's my only family." Sarah felt nauseated by her father's theater. While the adults discussed values and roles, her mind worked quickly. If Thunder were sold today, she would never have a chance to discover the truth about the ranch, about her mother. She would never escape from Frank's oppressive hands. It was at that moment that she saw Betty discreetly beckoning from the kitchen door. The woman pointed to the clock and then to the old oak, silently articulating the words, "Now or never." "I need to show one more special characteristic of Thunder," said Sarah suddenly, interrupting the negotiation. "He's trained for diverse terrains. May I demonstrate how he behaves near the creek?" Before Frank could protest, she had already led Thunder away from the demonstration field, toward the century-old oak. She could hear her father appeasing the buyers, promising they would return in minutes. Upon reaching the oak, Betty was already waiting for her, breathless from the run. "We don't have much time," said the cook, extending a small leather bundle. "Your mother left this with me before she left. These are the original documents of the ranch, showing that the property belonged to your maternal grandfather, Thomas Wilson. Your father was never the true owner. He manipulated the papers when he married Rebecca, taking advantage of her inexperience." After Thomas's departure, Sarah opened the bundle with trembling hands. Inside were old deeds, letters, sepia photographs showing a tall man with gentle eyes next to a much smaller ranch, but recognizable as the seed of what today was Hope Ranch. "My grandfather," she murmured, touching the photograph with reverence. "Is he alive?" "He is, and he lives in Beaufort. Your mother found him after years of searching. He was driven away from the family by your father's intrigues, who accused him of theft and threatened him. Thomas left to protect Rebecca, not knowing she was pregnant with you." The sound of hooves approaching interrupted the revelation. Frank was coming on his chestnut horse, his face contorted in fury, the whip once again in hand. "What do you think you're doing?" he shouted, dismounting quickly. "The buyers are waiting. And what is that in your hands?" Betty placed herself in front of Sarah, protective. "It's time for her to know the truth, Frank, about the ranch, about Thomas, about everything you've hidden all these years." Frank's face paled at the mention of his father-in-law, but soon the red of rage took over again. "You've always been a meddler, Betty," he hissed, advancing with the raised whip. "I should have fired you years ago." Everything happened very quickly. The whip came down, but it didn't hit Betty. Thunder, with his protective instinct, charged against Frank, pushing him with his powerful chest. The man staggered backward, tripping over the exposed roots of the oak and falling seated, the whip escaping from his hands. "Damned animal," he vociferated, trying to get up. "I'll end you today." It was at that moment that Sarah made her decision. In a fluid movement, she put the documents in her saddlebag, mounted Thunder, and extended her hand to Betty. "Come with me," she urged. "No, my child," Betty refused, with a sad smile. "My place is here. Someone needs to stay to ensure you have time to escape. Go to Beaufort. Look for your grandfather at the Blue Harbor Inn. He will be waiting for you, as he always has been." Hesitant, Sarah looked one last time at the woman who had been more of a mother than an employee during all those years. Frank was almost on his feet, his face disfigured by rage. "You'll regret this, Sarah," he shouted. "Without me you are—" "Nothing, nothing." But for the first time the threats didn't reach her. With a silent command she made Thunder gallop away, leaving behind the only home she had known, but taking with her the promise of a different future. Her father's shouts grew increasingly distant, until all that remained was the sound of Thunder's hooves against the earth, and the wind whispering in her ears words that sounded strangely like freedom. The road that opened before her was long and uncertain. Beaufort was many miles away, and she would have to cross towns, avoid the searches that her father would certainly organize, find shelter and food. But for the first time in years she didn't feel afraid. She had Thunder, she had the documents, and she had a destination. The grandfather she had never known, but who, according to Betty, had always waited for her. As the sun began to set on the horizon, coloring the sky in shades of orange and pink, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The life she knew had ended, but another, much more promising one, was just beginning. And if she had to face 1,000 storms to reach it, she wouldn't hesitate for a second. With renewed determination, she adjusted in the saddle and whispered in Thunder's ear, "Let's go home, friend, to our true home." The journey to Beaufort was more difficult than Sarah had imagined. Days turned into weeks as she traveled secondary roads to avoid main highways where she could be easily located. Thunder demonstrated an impressive resistance, as if he understood the importance of this journey. Together they crossed farms, small villages, and trails in the woods, stopping only as necessary to rest and eat. At each stop, Sarah remained vigilant. She knew her father well and knew he wouldn't give up easily, not out of love but out of wounded pride and the possibility of losing the ranch he had usurped. The documents she carried with her were proof that his entire life had been built on lies. For Frank Morgan, this was unforgivable. When she finally caught sight of the sea at Beaufort, with its calm waters and the colorful colonial aspect of the historic town, Sarah felt silent tears stream down her face. Thunder, as if also perceiving the change in the landscape, whinnied softly, slowing his pace as they approached the first houses. Beaufort was exactly like the photos she had seen in books, a preserved jewel of colonial America, with its colorful houses, century-old churches, and stone streets that witnessed centuries of history. People walked calmly, tourists took photos, and the smell of the sea mingled with the aroma of fresh fish and freshly brewed coffee coming from the small inns. "Excuse me, ma'am," Sarah approached a crafts vendor. "Could you tell me where the Blue Harbor Inn is?" The woman looked with curiosity at the young woman covered in road dust and the imposing horse accompanying her. "It's at the end of that street," she indicated, pointing to an alley that led to a square. "It's the blue house with white windows, but you won't be able to enter with the horse. There's a municipal stable on the other side of the square." Thanking her, Sarah led Thunder along the indicated path, her heart accelerating with each step. After leaving the animal in the care of a friendly handler at the municipal stable, she headed for the inn. It was an impeccably preserved colonial building with a simple carved wooden sign announcing Blue Harbor Inn since 1998. At the reception, an elderly man was organizing some keys behind the counter. When he turned, Sarah felt her legs weaken. Despite never having met before, she immediately recognized the amber eyes, exactly like hers and her mother's. "Thomas Wilson?" she asked with a trembling voice. The old man studied her for a moment, his forehead wrinkled in confusion that soon gave way to astonished understanding. "My God," he murmured, leaning on the counter as if he needed support. "You're the spitting image of your mother. You can only be... Sarah?" She nodded, unable to contain the tears that now flowed freely down her face. "How did you know I would come?" she asked, remembering Betty's words. "I didn't know," he replied, coming around the counter and approaching with hesitant steps. "But I hoped, every day since Rebecca found me, I hoped that one day you would come." The distance between the two diminished until, in a simultaneous movement, grandfather and granddaughter embraced for the first time. It was as if a lost piece of a puzzle had finally found its correct place. In the small apartment at the back of the inn, Thomas served tea while Sarah told everything that had happened. The escape, the journey, the documents, and especially the years of suffering at Frank's hands. "If I had known," lamented Thomas, his voice choked with emotion and guilt. "If I had any idea what you were going through—" "It wasn't your fault," consoled Sarah, covering her grandfather's wrinkled hand with hers. "It was he who lied, who manipulated everything and everyone." Thomas sighed deeply before beginning his own narrative. "Hope Ranch was originally a small property that I started with your maternal grandmother, Mary. When she passed, I continued alone, expanding little by little with a lot of work and dedication. Rebecca, my only daughter, grew up among the horses, developing a natural talent for training them." He smiled at the memory. "Then Frank appeared, charming, ambitious, promising the world to her. I saw beyond the facade, perceived his real intentions. When I tried to alert her, we argued for the first time." He paused, sipping his tea before continuing. "One day, I discovered falsified documents in the office, showing a transfer of the ranch to his name. I confronted him, and the discussion was terrible. He accused me of theft in front of the entire staff, planted evidence, and threatened to call the police. To protect Rebecca from the shame, I ended up leaving. What I didn't know was that she was pregnant with you." Sarah listened, stunned. Each piece of the puzzle finally fit together. "And my mother. Why did she also leave? Why did she leave me?" "She never wanted to leave you, Sarah." Thomas's eyes shone with contained tears. "After she found me, Rebecca was gathering evidence to legally recover the ranch. She intended to return with documents and lawyers, but when she confronted Frank, he threatened her, threatened to harm you if she tried to take you. She was caught between fighting for what was rightfully ours and risking your safety, or leaving to organize everything from a distance." Sarah remembered the letters mentioned by her father, the words in her mother's diary. So many things made sense now. "And where is she?" she asked, hope growing in her chest. "Why didn't she come with you to receive me?" The silence that followed made her heart race. Thomas lowered his eyes, an old grief emerging in his features. "Rebecca fell ill, Sarah." The old man's voice came out as a painful whisper. "The anguish of being away from you, the constant struggle to recover what was ours. It all consumed her. She passed away believing that one day you would discover the truth and find us. Her last request was that I never give up waiting for you." The pain was overwhelming. Sarah had lost her mother twice, first when Rebecca left the ranch, and now when she discovered she would never see her again. For a moment, the world seemed to slow down, as if time needed to make space for her renewed grief. But amidst the sadness, A resolution formed. Raising her chin in a gesture that very much resembled Rebecca, Sarah took the documents from her bag. "Then let's finish what she started," she declared, determined. "Let's recover what is rightfully ours." Thomas observed his granddaughter with a mix of admiration and concern. "It won't be easy, my child. Frank is a powerful and dangerous man. And I'm no longer the frightened girl he controlled," replied Sarah. "I have you now. I have the truth. And I have Thunder." The name of the horse made Thomas smile. "I know Thunder isn't a common name for a horse around here," commented Sarah. "Mom insisted on that name when he was born, even against my father's will. Now I understand why." Thomas nodded, moved. "Thunder was the name of the first horse your grandfather and I trained together, the animal that started the ranch. Rebecca never forgot the stories I told about him." The next morning, Sarah and Thomas sought out Daniel Parker, the most respected lawyer in Beaufort. After carefully examining the documents, he confirmed what they already knew. Hope Ranch legally belonged to Thomas Wilson and, by extension, to his legitimate heirs, Rebecca and now Sarah. "We can file a claim for repossession," explained the lawyer, adjusting his glasses. "But Frank will certainly fight. Prepare yourselves for a long legal battle." Sarah exchanged looks with her grandfather. The journey would be difficult, but now they had each other. And more importantly, they had the truth on their side. That night, while observing the Sea of Beaufort from the inn's veranda, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quietude. Somewhere, not too far from there, Frank was probably looking for her, furious with the loss of control he thought he had over her. But the fear that had dominated her for so long had been replaced by a serene determination. "We'll succeed, Mom," she whispered to the sea breeze, as if Rebecca could hear her. "We'll bring justice to our home." And as the stars appeared one by one in the dark sky, Sarah knew that the most important battle of her life was just beginning. 3 months passed since Sarah's arrival in Beaufort. The small coastal town, with its stone streets and historic houses, had become a temporary refuge while she and Thomas, with the help of lawyer Daniel Parker, prepared the legal case against Frank Morgan. The news that the legitimate heir of Hope Ranch had returned to claim her lands spread quickly through the region. Some former employees of the ranch, who had witnessed Thomas's forced departure years ago, got in touch offering testimonies. Among them was Jimmy, the handler who had cared for Thunder for so many years. "Your father has been out of control since your departure," Jimmy told during a visit to the inn. "He fired Mrs. Betty the next day, accusing her of conspiracy. But she's doing well, got a job at the mayor's house in Silver Creek. She asked me to tell you she's proud of you." Sarah smiled at the news about Betty. The old cook had been crucial to her escape, and knowing she was safe was a relief. "And the ranch, how is it?" she asked, trying to sound casual despite the anxiety she felt for news of her former home. Jimmy lowered his eyes, hesitant. "Not good, Sarah. Your father has been drinking more than ever. Business is being neglected, horses poorly cared for. Those buyers from Atlanta gave up after your escape. Many others too, when rumors about the dispute over the property began to circulate." The news made Sarah's heart tighten. Despite everything, Hope Ranch was more than a piece of land. It was her family's legacy, built with love by her grandfather, kept alive by her mother. Seeing it deteriorate was painful. "We made a settlement offer," commented Thomas, who was accompanying the conversation. "Daniel sent a proposal to Frank's lawyer. He could keep part of the money accumulated in recent years if he recognized the property as ours and withdrew peacefully." "And what did he say?" asked Jimmy. "He tore up the proposal in front of the messenger," replied Thomas with a sigh, "and sent word that he would wait for us in court." The date of the trial was finally set for early December, 6 months after Sarah's escape. In the meantime, she found comfort in getting to know her grandfather better, a gentle man whose greatest regret was the time lost away from his daughter and granddaughter. Together, they spent hours sharing stories, filling the voids of decades of forced separation. Thomas had transformed the pain of loss into something productive. The Blue Harbor Inn was known not only for its hospitality, but also for its small stable, where he treated horses rescued from mistreatment. "It was my way of keeping the connection with the past alive," he explained one afternoon, while Sarah helped him with a newly arrived colt. "Horses have always been the bond of our family." Thunder had adapted perfectly to the new routine. The imposing Tennessee Walker seemed happy with the dawn rides on the beach and with the company of the other rescued horses. Often, tourists stopped to admire the majestic animal, and Sarah secretly prided herself when they commented on the special connection between her and the horse. It was during one of these morning rides on the beach that Sarah realized she was being followed. A middle-aged man, dressed casually like a tourist, had been watching her for days. Alarmed, she commented to Daniel about her suspicions. "It's probably some investigator hired by your father," concluded the lawyer after hearing her description. "He must be trying to discover something he can use against you in court. Stay vigilant, but don't worry too much. The documents are on our side." The week preceding the trial was the most tense. Sarah could barely sleep, haunted by nightmares, in which she returned to being the frightened girl under her father's dominion. In the few hours of rest, she dreamed of her mother, of the ranch, of the sunny days when Rebecca taught her to ride. On the eve of the big day, while organizing the documents for the umpteenth time, an urgent knock on the inn's door surprised everyone. Daniel answered it, returning with a grave expression and an envelope in his hands. "It's from Judge Baker's office," he announced. "Frank has filed a motion to postpone the trial, claiming to have discovered new documents that would prove his right to the property." Sarah felt the blood freeze in her veins. "Can he do that on the eve of the trial?" "Unfortunately, yes," confirmed Daniel, opening the envelope. "But the judge still needs to evaluate the request and—" He suddenly stopped, his eyes widening as he examined the contents. "What is it?" asked Sarah and Thomas in unison. "The judge denied the request," replied Daniel, our smile slowly forming. "And more. He states that the supposed new documents presented by Frank contain clear evidence of forgery, which aggravates his situation in the main process." A collective sigh of relief filled the room. It was the first sign that justice might finally prevail. The next day, the Justice Forum of Silver Creek, the town where Hope Ranch was registered, was full. The case had attracted the attention of local media, and many residents of the region attended out of curiosity, some rooting for the powerful local rancher, others sympathetic to the young woman seeking her right. When Frank Morgan entered the premises, Sarah felt her body stiffen. He seemed older, more haggard, but the look of contained fury was the same she had feared for so many years. For an instant their gazes crossed, and she could see the flash of surprise in his eyes. Surprise at seeing her confronting him, at finding no more fear in her countenance. The trial was long and intense. Frank's lawyer argued that, regardless of the property's origin, his client had developed it for decades, transforming it into a successful enterprise through his hard work. He tried to discredit Thomas, insinuating that his disappearance for so many years evidenced voluntary abandonment of the patrimony. Then it was Daniel's turn. With surgical precision, he presented the chronology of events, supported by original documents, bank records, and testimonies. The story that emerged was clear. An ambitious man who had manipulated documents, threatened his father-in-law, and kept his wife and daughter under control through fear and violence, all to appropriate lands that had never belonged to him. The crucial moment came when Jimmy took the witness stand. The old handler, with a voice choked but firm, described the years of abuse he had witnessed, including the incident with the whip that culminated in Sarah's escape. His testimony was so visceral that several people in the audience were silently crying. "And the horse, Thunder," he concluded, looking directly at Sarah. "That animal did more for the ranch in recent years than any human. He seemed to understand everything, feel everything. The day he placed himself between Sarah and the whip, it was as if the very land of the ranch was rebelling against injustice." The metaphor didn't go unnoticed. Many nodded, moved by the idea of the loyal horse protecting his owner, like the spirit of the ranch itself rescuing its true heir. When the judge finally announced his decision, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. After meticulous analysis of the evidence presented, this court recognizes the legitimacy of the original documents attesting to the ownership of Hope Ranch by Thomas Wilson and his direct descendants. Additionally, in light of evidence of document forgery and other crimes, I order an investigation to be opened against the defendant, Frank Morgan. The repossession must be executed within 30 days. There was a moment of silence, followed by an explosion of applause and exclamations. Sarah remained paralyzed, unable to fully process what she had just heard. Only when she felt her grandfather's arms around her did the tears begin to flow, years of pain and fear finally finding release. The other side of the courtroom, Frank was livid, his hands gripping the table in front of him tightly. When the gazes of father and daughter crossed once more, there was no triumph in Sarah's countenance, just a mix of relief and a hint of pity for the man who had chosen the path of bitterness and greed. A month later, Sarah returned to Hope Ranch, no longer as a prisoner, but as its legitimate owner. Thunder by her side seemed to sense the significance of the moment, stepping with pride as they crossed the main gates. The ranch was different, neglected in some aspects, but still beautiful in its essence. Thomas, who hadn't set foot on those lands for decades, couldn't contain his tears as he recognized trees he himself had planted, buildings he had helped erect. "It's like going back in time," he murmured, observing the fields that stretched to the horizon. "Your mother would be so proud, Sarah, so proud." In the months that followed, Hope Ranch underwent a transformation. With Thomas's experienced guidance and Sarah's renewed energy, the property began to flourish again. Former employees returned, including Mrs. Betty, who resumed her post in the kitchen with tears of joy. But the biggest change wasn't just in the physical facilities. Sarah had decided to transform part of the ranch into a sanctuary for horses, rescued from mistreatment, inspired by her grandfather's work in Beaufort. She had also created an educational program where children from public schools came to learn about the animals and nature. "I want this place to heal not just the horses, but also people," she explained to Thomas as they planned the new facilities, "for it to be a refuge for wounded souls, just as Thunder was for me." On a sunny spring afternoon, almost a year after her escape, Sarah was riding along one of the most remote trails on the property. Thunder, always sensitive to her mood, followed in a smooth gallop, as if he knew she needed that moment of reflection. Upon reaching the top of a hill, from where one could see the entire expanse of the ranch, Sarah dismounted and sat on the grass, Thunder grazing peacefully beside her. From there she observed the activity, handlers caring for the animals, children laughing during a riding lesson, Thomas supervising the construction of the new recovery center for rescued horses. A feeling of fullness filled her chest. The fear that had dominated her for so long had been replaced by a serene certainty. This was her place in the world, her purpose. Hope Ranch, as its very name suggested, was being reborn as a symbol of renewal and possibilities. Thunder approached, pressing, his muzzle against her shoulder, as he had done since he was a colt. Sarah hugged him, feeling the strength and loyalty of that magnificent animal who, at a decisive moment, had had the courage to do what no human had done before, defied tyranny to protect someone he loved. "Thank you, my friend," she whispered, stroking his mane, "for everything." As the sun began to set on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Sarah knew she was finally home. Not just in the physical sense, but in the deepest meaning of the word. She was at peace with her past, connected to her roots, and open to the infinite possibilities of the future. And in Thunder's soft whinny, she could almost hear an echo of her mother's voice saying that everything would be all right. That from now on only days of light awaited her at Hope Ranch, the place where, against all odds, lashes had been transformed into caresses and a simple horse had forever changed the course of a family's history. 2 years had passed since Sarah had recovered Hope Ranch. The property, once a symbol of pain and oppression, had flourished under her care, transforming into a true paradise for humans and animals alike. What was once merely a profitable horse-breeding business had become a complex that housed different social and environmental projects. On a sunny Sunday morning, Sarah observed the activity of the ranch from the porch of the main house. The Recovery Center for Rescued Horses, an idea that emerged after her own experience with Thunder, had already welcomed more than 50 mistreated animals from throughout the region. Most of them, after rehabilitation, had found new homes. Others, with permanent sequelae, remained as residents, receiving special care and participating in the therapeutic program with children and the elderly. Deep in thought, my dear? Thomas's voice interrupted her reverie. At 75, the man maintained the vitality of someone much younger, especially when involved with the horses. Just appreciating everything we've managed to build, Grandpa, she replied, making room on the bench for him to sit beside her. Sometimes it still seems like a dream. Thomas smiled, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape he had thought he would never see again. Your mother would be amazed. Hope Ranch finally lives up to its name. One of Sarah's most successful initiatives was the Hooves and Books program, which combined therapeutic riding with educational support for children from underprivileged families. 3 times a week, school buses brought students from public schools in Silver Creek and neighboring towns for an afternoon at the ranch. Besides learning about animal care, the children participated in support classes taught by volunteer teachers. Mrs. Betty, who now coordinated not only the kitchen but also the production of organic foods in the community garden, approached with a tray of fresh lemonade. "It's good to see you two resting a bit," she commented, serving the glasses. "Especially you, Sarah. Seems like you didn't sleep last night." Sarah laughed, accepting the cold drink with gratitude. Betty knew her too well. "It's the anxiety about today's visit. I want everything to be perfect." That afternoon, Hope Ranch would receive representatives from the Department of Agriculture and the State Department of Education of Virginia. The therapeutic riding and environmental education program developed by Sarah had caught the attention of the authorities, and there was the possibility of a partnership that would expand the project to other regions of the state. "Everything will be fine," assured Thomas, affectionately squeezing his granddaughter's hand. "The work you've been doing speaks for itself." As they finished the lemonade, Jimmy appeared hurriedly riding toward the house. The old handler, now the principal supervisor of the ranch's equestrian operations, seemed agitated. "Miss Sarah, a delegation is arriving. More than 5 cars, and 2 of them are from the state government." Sarah stood up quickly, fixing her hair and shirt. "So early? They weren't supposed to arrive until after lunch?" "And there's more," continued Jimmy, dismounting with an agility that belied his almost 60 years. "One of the cars has the emblem of Eastern Virginia University. I think there are people from the veterinary school with them." This was news. No one had mentioned representatives from the university. Intrigued, Sarah headed to the main gate to welcome the visitors, accompanied by Thomas and Betty. The arriving delegation was larger than expected. Besides the government representatives, there were journalists and indeed professors from EVU. Among them, Sarah immediately recognized Dr. Richard Turner, a renowned specialist in equine behavior, whose articles she had avidly studied in recent years to improve the ranch's therapeutic program. "Welcome to Hope Ranch, Dr. Turner," she greeted, extending her hand. "It's an honor to have you here. I didn't know you would be participating in the visit." The middle-aged man with graying hair and lively eyes behind thin-framed glasses smiled warmly. "The honor is mine, Ms. Morgan. I've been following the extraordinary work you've been developing here. In fact, it was I who insisted on accompanying the government delegation." As Sarah guided the visitors around the ranch, their interest was visible. The government representatives took notes. The journalists recorded everything with cameras and recorders, and the university professors asked pertinent questions about the methods used. But it was Dr. Turner who showed the most enthusiasm, especially when he met Thunder. "This is the famous horse that protected you, isn't it?" he asked, approaching the imposing animal respectfully. "Yes," confirmed Sarah, stroking Thunder's shining neck. "He changed my life in ways I can't even adequately express." Dr. Turner carefully observed the interaction between the two, noting the silent communication they shared. "You know, in my entire career I've studied exceptional cases of connection between horses and humans, but rarely have I seen something as profound as what you two demonstrate," he commented. "What happened here goes far beyond instinctive animal behavior. It's something almost transcendental. The group proceeded to the recovery center, where horses rescued from precarious situations underwent physical and behavioral treatment. A special area housed the animals that participated in therapeutic sessions with autistic children and elderly people with Alzheimer's. The results were remarkable, with significant improvements documented by doctors and therapists. After visiting the facilities, everyone gathered in the newly constructed auditorium for a formal presentation. Thomas showed the history of Hope Ranch, from its foundation to the challenges faced and overcome. Sarah, in turn, detailed the current projects and future plans, including the expansion of the educational program and the creation of a research center in equine behavior. When the presentation ended, the representative from the Department of Agriculture stood up, visibly impressed. "What you've built here is extraordinary, Ms. Morgan, far beyond what we expected to find. The department not only supports the expansion of the program, but would like to propose that Hope Ranch become a national model, a reference center for similar initiatives throughout the United States." The room erupted in applause. Sarah, moved, could hardly believe what she was hearing. She wasn't prepared for what would come next. Dr. Turner asked to speak, rising with a sincere smile. The School of Veterinary Medicine at Eastern Virginia University would like to formalize an invitation. "We are initiating a research program on therapeutic riding and animal behavior, and we would like Hope Ranch to be our official partner. Furthermore," he paused, addressing Sarah directly, "we would like to invite you to join our faculty as her visiting professor, sharing your unique experience with our students." A murmur of surprise and approval ran through the auditorium. Sarah looked at Thomas, who nodded with evident pride in his gaze. She had left this very ranch years ago as a terrified young woman, fleeing on Thunder's back with no idea where to go. Now she was being recognized as a specialist, a pioneer in her field. "It would be an honor to accept both invitations, Dr. Turner," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. "The knowledge I've acquired here deserves to be shared, just as the animals we rescue deserve all the research and care we can offer." The meeting continued, with animated discussions about the details of the partnerships. When it finally ended, it was almost night. The visitors left, promising to return soon with formal documents and detailed proposals. Exhausted but radiant, Sarah headed to the stable for a moment alone with Thunder, before retiring. The horse greeted her with a soft whinny, as if he knew she needed that moment of quietude after such an intense day. As she brushed his mane, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey they had shared. "Did you ever imagine we would come so far, friend?" she whispered, resting her forehead against the animal's neck. "From fugitives to national examples, who would have thought?" Thunder snorted softly, as if responding in his own way. At that moment, Dr. Turner's words echoed in her mind. Something almost transcendental. Yes, what she and Thunder had went beyond the usual relationship between human and animal. It was a partnership forged in adversity, tempered by loyalty, and transformed into something that now touched the lives of hundreds of people and animals. As she walked back to the house under the starry sky, Sarah felt a deep peace. The path ahead was clear now. She would continue expanding the work at Hope Ranch and simultaneously share her knowledge through the university. The suffering of the past had been transformed into purpose, into mission. On the threshold of the door, Thomas waited for her with a steaming cup of tea and a warm smile. "Rebecca always said you were destined for great things," he commented, handing her the hot drink. "She always knew who you really were long before you discovered it yourself." Sarah smiled, her heart full of gratitude for the mother who, even physically absent, continued to guide her path through the memories and love she had planted. "You know, Grandpa, I think I finally understood the true meaning of this place's name. Hope isn't just about waiting for better days. It's about creating those days with our own hands, even when everything seems impossible." Thomas nodded, his eyes bright with emotion and pride. "And that's exactly what you've been doing, my dear. Day after day, rebuilding not just a ranch but entire lives, including your own." Together they entered the house that was now truly a home. From the stable, Thunder's distant whinny sounded like a final blessing for that extraordinary day. A day that marked not the end of a journey, but the beginning of many others. On the horizon of Hope Ranch, the future was drawing brighter than ever, illuminated by the courage of a young woman who dared to defy her oppressor, by the loyalty of a horse that protected its owner when no one else did, and by the transformative power of love that, like the most resilient of seeds, flourishes even in the most arid soils, bringing life and renewal to everything it touches. Dear listeners, we hope that Sarah and Thunder's journey has touched your hearts. To continue this emotional voyage, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories about overcoming and courage. Find it here clicking on the left. If you were moved by this narrative, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like on the video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexities of life and the bonds we form with those we love, be they human or animal. Don't miss our upcoming content and share with us in the comments which moment of Sarah's story touched your heart the most. We're eager to read your impressions.